The country certainly needs to be a lot more unified if it's going to survive.
For Americans, the stakes are just very high.
That's probably one of the few times that I deviate from my libertarianism is when it comes to the protection of our children.
The job has gotten a lot harder because you're doing more with less.
Progress is progress, and there's a lot of people working to make that progress happen.
It's either this or I have zero options.
I grew up knowing that the police were the most dangerous people that you're going to encounter.
You know, these things are just normal life.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Unpacking America, the podcast seeking to understand and unpack America one conversation at a time. I am John David Easling, your host, and I'm tremendously excited today because episode 3 means we are now the smallest possible number that can be identified as a pattern, and that means we're a thing with a capital T. We're no longer just two random episodes floating out there in the ether. We are now fully up and running. We're hitting the ground. We are getting support from our listeners, which has been incredible. I want to say thank you to everybody who's tuned in so far, who's sent their support either directly to us or just by plugging in and listening and experiencing what we're trying to do. So thank you very much. It has genuinely been overwhelming. Also, in a very exciting vein, we are looking for our guests for season 2 of Unpacking America, which we are hoping to launch in late August or early September of 2023. So if you would like to be involved as a guest, or if you think there is someone that we should be reaching out to directly, we'd love to hear from you. The best way to get in contact with us at the moment is to email us directly at unpackingamericapod@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you, so please get in touch. On that note, without wasting any more of your precious time and getting straight into the interview, let's kick off episode 3.
It's really an interesting catch-22, and it really, because the libertarian fights with the conservative in me, because the conservative in me wants to squash anything and everything, specifically when it comes to anything that puts our children in danger.
Today I'm sitting down with Ryan, who is a farmer in Northern California, or as he refers to it, the northern state or the state of Jefferson. This was a conversation I was really excited to have because I haven't had many interactions with people living in rural areas in the US. I'm living in Southern California. It's quite a built up, quite an urban area. So to really get to grips and talk to someone who's from a different part of the US, even though it's in the same state that I'm living in, was really interesting to me. And because of that, I ask a lot of questions and I do a lot of challenging. So today's episode will be covering a very broad range of subjects, and we will be exploring all sorts of things from living in rural parts of America to ideologies behind conservatism and libertarianism in the US. And I say specifically in the US because coming from a country that isn't America, my understanding, or my, if you'll call it a brand of conservatism, is very different to what I see and hear conservatives doing in the US. And this gets a little bit even more confusing when you think about Australia, where we have a party referred to as Liberal Party, who at their founding was considered to be economically liberal, socially conservative. So our Conservative Party in Australia is somewhat ironically called the Liberal Party. We also have another major party called the Labour Party. They are sort of, I guess, what you would call slightly left of centre. Again, they are not as differentiated as the two major political parties, or I should say the only political parties in the US. And certainly the increasing polarization of politics in the US is something that's very deeply interesting to me. And while it's very fascinating for me as an outsider looking in to learn more about the different views and philosophies of Americans, I do think in this episode in particular, there is going to be content that is disturbing or offensive to the LGBT community and potentially others as well. So with that being said, as always with this podcast, approach it with an open mind. These views are not going to be views you necessarily hold, or they may be views that you identify with. The purpose is always to try and find some middle ground. and to try and find something within any conversation that we have on this show that you, as a listener in America, can relate to. So with that being said and done, I'm going to let Ryan tell his story. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today on Unpacking America. Really excited to have you on the show and to just get right into it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's start at the start. What was it like growing up in rural Northern California?
I grew up in a not so small town, but by most people's standard, a fairly small town in Northern California. We had a 112-acre horse ranch and 45 horses, which is roughly 45 too many if you're counting. But my childhood was, can't quite say run of the mill. It was pretty unique, all things considered, having so much space to run around on, and we had 112 acres, which is it's a good chunk of land. I was a pretty independent kid, especially in my younger years. My mom never really knew where I was. I was always out in the back 40, hunting, fishing, hiding, building forts. I remember the first time I got in trouble for strategically borrowing my father's chainsaw.
Okay.
And I safely felled some trees, but it was less than optimal for for the property. Oh, but boy, was it fun.
So was the felling of trees for a constructive or useful purpose, like a building of a fort or something?
Yes. Some of it was. I actually, when I was about 12-ish, 12, 11, 12, I actually built a rather neat little log cabin. It was, probably about 8 feet wide and 12 or so feet long. Everything except for the door and the little stove was entirely made from materials that I sourced off the property. I cut down all the little pine trees and limbed them out. Most of that I actually did with a simple little crosscut saw that I bought from a yard sale, and then I had a nice little limbing saw. I stole out of my dad's camping gear, but made a nice little fort and little log cabinish thing. And just because there's plenty of manzanita and other materials, and it was a lot of fun doing a lot of cool bushcraft stuff growing up. It's an experience a lot of kids unfortunately never have the chance to enjoy or explore. It's actually something that I kind of pity some of the city kids, the kids who grow up, unable to have, the space to explore like that. It's something every kid should experience.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you. And I think some of my fondest memories as a child were going up to Central Australia or even our local sort of parklands and bushlands and, catching tadpoles or small fish and getting out there and just exploring the wilderness. And I think as cities get bigger and parents get more protective, and rightly so, we see less and less of that in kids' lives in first world countries. So, wild childhood aside, what does the opportunity start to look like as you grow up? Jobs in northern rural California, are they limited to agriculture or tourism? I'll confess I don't know much about the area, so I'm wondering what do those opportunities look like for young people as they enter the workforce?
Well, it's certainly not tourism, at least for my part of the North State. The only sort of tourism we have is we got some couple of nice lakes, and that's about it. And some folks come up to water ski around and spend their money at the marina, and that's about it for tourism for the North State. But in the way of employment opportunities, there's outside of your 9 to 5 minimum wage jobs, there's not a whole lot other than construction. Well, at least for the men. I can't speak so much for the women. There's a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? There's more city-like jobs, or more office jobs available for women out here than there are for the men. But it's pretty much construction, agriculture, or or welfare. There's a lot of that out here, and a lot of people seem to think that that's a way to make a living. And unfortunately, in the state of California, they take enough of our taxes that plenty of folks do get to make a living that way.
So you see unemployment and homelessness as big issues in your part of the world?
A lot more than they used to be. When I was a kid, I actually used to volunteer when I was young through the church. We would volunteer our time at the Jesus Center up in Northern California, and there was enough beds at the Jesus Center that every homeless person who wanted one was able to have one, and there was 25 or maybe 50 at most homeless folks in the whole area. In a town of 100,000, that's or a city of 100,000. That was quite a lot of homeless. And nowadays, I live in a town of, I think, 9 or 10,000, or it might be a little more than that. It might be 15,000 here, and there's, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 homeless folks just that I've noticed, that I've seen just here in town. It's a tremendous problem, and the problem is that people keep giving incentives for these folks to either, one, not fix their situation on their own, but two, they're giving them incentives to come here and not change their lifestyles. And I'm just as compassionate as the next fella, and it breaks my heart seeing a lot of these folks, who are suffering through homelessness. But we're not helping them by giving them just enough to survive. They need to be able to, get out of the situation they're in, and by giving them just enough to keep them, strung along is not the right way to do that.
I mean, I certainly don't disagree that it's a massive issue right now in the US. Talking to my own experience coming to the US in the peak of COVID in 2020, like one of the very first things that I saw was shanty towns for the first time in my life. Seeing the volume and magnitude of homelessness that I'd sort of never witnessed before in a first world country. And while it's not to say Australia doesn't have issues with homelessness and poverty, I just never seen it on this scale.
Yeah, it's it actually it's almost 100 years from the last time we had these sorts of problems, when they used to call them Hoovervilles, when during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. It was more or less the same thing. Well, the homelessness was so high, and people would build these little tent cities and live in them. And here we are, just under 100 years later, and I hope it's not a cyclical thing, but it's unfortunately appearing to be so. But hopefully we'll find a way out of this mess here soon. If not, we're gonna bankrupt ourselves to do so.
So what's the solution then? Because if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, you see welfare as a way of trapping people in a sort of perpetual cycle of poverty, and there needs to be a way out. So if there is a better solution, what is it?
Well, so homelessness, and just to broaden it a little bit, let's throw welfare in there as well. And my personal feelings on welfare is it should exist, but welfare should be the ladder out of poverty, not the excuse to stay in it. There are far too many people who think, oh, the Uncle Sam's going to write me a check because I decided to have a bunch of children out of wedlock. I can't have, I can't afford a job, or I can't afford childcare, or I can't afford this, I can't do this. So now it's the responsibility of the American taxpayer to, float my bills. And unfortunately, there's too many people and a lot of it comes from a good place. A lot of people, vote for laws or bills that support, boosting, welfare, or broadening welfare, or, helping the homeless, and giving all this extra stuff to these people who aren't working for it. But all it's doing is it's prolonging their suffering. I'm a big believer in the rip the Band-Aid off philosophy. If you keep babying people, they'll never better themselves. But if you pull the rug out from underneath them, let them fall on their butts, they'll have two choices: stand up and get your stuff figured out, or die. And as tough as that sounds, and I don't necessarily mean just outright die, but it sounds really harsh and it sounds really heartless, but it comes from a place of love. I have a real soft spot for folks who are in situations, specifically for people who are in situations that they didn't put themselves in.
So is this the expression I hear a lot since I've moved to the US about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps?
It certainly is. You got to pull yourself up, because it's not anybody else's responsibility to pull you up. There's a lot of entitlement that goes around these days, specifically with my generation and the generation behind me. There's a lot of people who feel that things are owed to them. Take this, minimum wage in California is $15 an hour. When I had my first job, I made $10 an hour, and I was a roofer in the California summer. It'd be 115 degrees, and I was up on that black roof, and I was ripping it off and putting a new roof on, and I was 16 years old. I made sure that my ends met. I always took care of myself, and there's no reason that anybody else, it shouldn't be able to do that. And especially now as in my older years, I'm broken. Physically, I got titanium plates and screws in my body. I'm missing fingers. I've broken just about every bone in my body, but I go to work every day. I get up at 6 a.m, and if I'm lucky, I'm home before 6 at night. And there's no reason anybody else can't do that.
Are you happy with that though? Working 12-hour days after having broken every bone in your body and still not making huge sums of money?
I am. It's almost become a gimmick now, but people say dirty hands, clean money. My conscience is clear. I don't have to worry about where my money goes, where it comes from. I know that I earned it. It's fair. My money supports my family. I've worked my whole life specifically to have a wife and children. And fortunately, as of a little over 6 months ago, I'm now in a position where I could say I've achieved those dreams, what I would say is arguably the American dream. And I had to do everything right. And it took me a lot longer than I would have liked. It took me about 10 years longer than I thought growing up to find the right woman and, be smart enough with my finances that I could, afford the house and the vehicles and the toys and, get all the stuff I wanted and, have a family. And me of all people, who's, according to most of my friends and family, a bit of a screw up, if I can figure it out, there's no reason everybody else can't.
I certainly, and I suspect most people who fall into the millennial or Gen Z category at the moment can identify with things taking longer than they want them to. We're not moving as quickly as our parents' generations did. Things are harder. Things are slower. It's tougher out there. It really is.
We have our parents to thank for that, though, with with the way that they ran this economy into the ground. And I mean, the house that my grandparents bought so shortly after World War II, my grandparents bought this house that at the time was considered an expensive house. And I think they spent, I want to say it was $75,000, which at the time was an exorbitant amount of money for a house. But, my grandparents were not well off, but they were both respected, especially within the community. But, they were doing well for themselves. They raised a whole bunch of kids. And they had this beautiful house, and that it sold for, it was what, 4 or 5 years, 4 or 5 years ago now, and the house sold for like close to $500,000. And there's no way that the sum of the parts of that now 70 some odd year old house is worth that kind of money. And of course, that can be explained away by artificially keeping all the interest rates low on the housing market. And well, we remember what happened in 2008, and now I live in a place where my household income is over $100,000 my gross, not my net, is over $100,000, and I can't afford to buy a house in California.
Whereabouts was that house?
It's actually the town I grew up. My high school years I spent in the little podunk town of Gridley, California. If you're lucky, you can find it on a map. There's some maps that don't have it. Well, wow. I think they might have fixed that by now, but.
Surely Google has got it together now and put Gridley on the map. And if not, then hashtag justice for Gridley. Get him on the map, Google. But all joking about Gridley aside, you did start to touch on the American dream a moment ago. And it's something, I hear a lot of people have thoughts and comments on. And I'd love to unpack yours just a little bit more.
I still think that the American dream is still that, wife and kids. And specifically, I should also add that the American dream should not be mama has to go to work too. It should be that dad should be able to go have a job that affords mom to stay home and raise her children so they don't have to be wards of the state, which is kind of a whole nother can of worms for me. But I think a lot of why we no longer have, some of the collective goals is because of school, because of public school. People aren't being, raised to, want to do things on their own. We're not being raised to look at the stars anymore, to want to explore the stars. We're simply being told, we're being, hammered into molds and told to, basically do this or do this, and otherwise you won't ever become a successful person, because they want to make you for lack of a better analogy, they just want you to be another lever puller in a factory. They don't want you to be a free thinker. They don't want you to be which is really important nowadays, they don't want you to be a critical thinker, and they want you to be prepped and ready to go directly into a cubicle on some numbered floor on a giant building where you push papers across the desk. And I think that's why we're looking at a younger generation who don't aspire to be anything other than an influencer. There's no drive to be something greater,
So there's a couple of things there for me. One is that I think parents have a larger role to play in the inspiration of a young mind than a school. That's my personal view. Secondly, I think things like TikTok influencing or paths to social media fame were not options when you and I were young, So we did dream about being astronauts or something very large and aspirational, because the accessibility of finding fame wasn't at our fingertips like it is today for young people today. Becoming a TikTok influencer is accessible. Anyone can do it. It's hard, but anyone can do it. And I don't think it's fair to say that that's something that schools have, failed to inspire young minds. I think that's just a condition of the digital age we're emerging into.
Certainly. I guess I did slide a little away from where I was trying to get to on that. And you're absolutely right. When we were kids, I remember growing up, my brother, he always wanted to be two things. He wanted to be a singer, though he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket with a set of handles. Still can't, for the record, he still can't. But he also wanted to be a lawyer. And going back on the economy, I remember his big thing. I remember it vividly. He always used to tell me, "I'm going to make $1 million before you." And now that I'm in my 30s, and the way the economy has gone with our national debt, the dollar is so devalued, especially after all the free checks that are handed out during the lockdowns. $1 million is not that much money. It truly isn't anymore. But our economy has gone down, which really ties back into the whole, it's getting hard to get anywhere and to pursue that American dream.
It does also tap back into what you were saying earlier about minimum wage. What $10 an hour got you back then versus what $15 an hour gets you now. These things have not grown. $1 million is worth a whole lot less than it was before. So is $15. In fact, it's worth considerably less than it used to be. And I come from a country that has quite a high minimum wage, but we treat things differently. Like, we don't tip hospitality workers because we know they're paid a good living hourly wage. So I see exactly what you're saying, but it's harder now. Like, everything is harder. And that's whether you're pulling yourself up by the bootstraps or not. Doesn't matter how hard you're spinning your wheels right now. It's tougher than it was.
Well, that there's a lot of truth to that, and which actually goes back to that $15 an hour. So when I was making the $10 an hour as a roofer, minimum wage was actually $7.25. I was making above minimum wage, and at the time, making $10 an hour, working 65 hours a week or so, I was making really good money for a 16 and 17-year-old kid in the middle of nowhere, California. I was actually making really good money, but I look at it now, and for my buying power just 15 years ago when I was doing this, my buying power was so much greater than it is today, and that's because they want these wage hikes to $15 an hour. Well, sure, now you get $15 an hour, but you lose your buying power because that gallon of milk that was $3 a month ago is now $7 today because the grocery store has to raise prices to afford all their employees this $15 an hour. And the joke that the people who keep pushing these, $15 minimum wage, hikes, the joke is on the employees who don't understand that they're voting their own buying power away. It's just inflation because ever since we got pulled off the gold standard, they've just been printing money for funsies, and that's why inflation has gone through the roof. Of course, they rename inflation all the time. That's more or less what Bill Clinton did in the 90s, which is why we were quote unquote in a surplus at the time. And to be fair, which is hard for the conservative in me to say, but Bill Clinton, with all of his faults aside, he actually was you'd consider him a fiscally conservative person by today's standards.
It's interesting because now we're starting to tap into, I feel, more of these conservative values. They've started to come out through our conversation quite naturally in terms of how you feel a family should be run or how you feel a country should operate. And I know earlier you mentioned the Jesus Center, and were you raised religious as well?
I was raised a Christian boy. We went to church most Sundays, went to Sunday school. I think that every kid should have some sort of a good, solid organization, especially when they're young, because it teaches morals. And specifically, it's actually why my wife and I just recently started going back to church since we've had our daughter, because I want her raised with those good, solid moral foundations. And we've had conversations about when my daughter gets old enough to understand church and everything about it and the implications of religion, that she'll be able to make her own decisions once she's old enough, if she wants to continue attending church or if she wants to explore other religions. If she wants to, I will allow it. For the time being, I think that church is incredibly important for morals, to having a solid foundation, and not just even in the, oh, I'm not going to stab you, or I'm not going to shoot you kind of morals. I just mean in the sense of you learn how to operate within a community of people. You know how to expect things from others and how to, be, have things expected of you, and how to behave properly in a social setting. And doing so in with the church, it's a lot more forgiving than the real world sometimes. So as a kid, you learn how to make friends or talk to those who are your seniors, and both in the short and in the long.
So you see that as important in having an intergenerational community.
Yeah. And so it allows you to see the long term and not just the short term, especially as a kid. When you're in high school, you think you know it all, and the older I get, the more I know that I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think talking to a lot of my peers, that lesson of realizing how little you actually knew at a time where you thought you knew it all doesn't really hit until your 30s. I mean, for some people, it's obviously different, but I think for a lot of us, we blunder our way through our 20s thinking we're absolutely correct about everything we're doing. And then sooner or later, something humbles you and you start to do some introspection. I think for me, that humbling came when I started also to realize my body was no longer invincible.
It's amazing how quick that humbles you, isn't it?
Right. I mean, yeah. I feel we're in dangerous territory of just devolving into two old men getting crotchety and talking about their aches and pains. And for a good podcast, that will not make. So what I'd like to do is pivot slightly, if we can, and sort of address one of the reasons we're sitting down today, which is libertarianism, because it's a term that's relatively new to me. It's not a political movement in Australia, but it is something that you personally identify with. Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in live and let live. You can do whatever you want as long as you do it on your own property and you don't affect me and mine. I mean, that's more or less what this nation was founded on. The whole idea of no taxation without representation was that if I can't be myself, and if I can't represent myself, and if I can't be heard, then you have no right to control me or to have anything over me. And that can be scaled all the way down to neighbors, where I don't, my neighbor shouldn't have any, if he's not paying my bills, then he has no reason to tell me what I can and can't do, which is why HOAs, I think, are just terrible.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think you've sort of touched on two very uniquely American propositions in in one sentence there. Really, yes, HOAs are awful. They do exist in other parts of the world, but I don't think they exist quite with their malevolence that they exist in the US. The other, though, is libertarianism, as we started to talk about. It really does feel like a uniquely American proposition. I'm sure there are people in other parts of the world that really identify with it, even within Australia, but to see it practiced as a political movement is something that I've never seen before.
Well, that's the reason why is there's no other country on the planet that has the First and Second Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. My right to free speech, which is super important. If I want to be able to be a libertarian, I need to be able to say what I want and do what I want, and that should be protected, just as your right to say and do what you want is protected. And of course, the Second Amendment itself, the First Amendment couldn't exist without the Second Amendment, because if you try and step on the first, the Second Amendment's there to make sure that you don't take that second step. Autonomy couldn't exist in a free nation without having the right to free speech recognized. And I say recognized because the Constitution doesn't grant me the right to free speech. It doesn't grant me the right to of movement. It doesn't grant me the right to resist unlawful search and seizure. It doesn't grant me the right to own firearms. The Constitution simply is a set of rules that the government must comply to, because God gave me the right to free speech. God gave me the right to bear arms. God gave me the right to tell a soldier he can't stay in my house. There's an amendment for that, believe it or not. That goes back to Revolutionary War days. But these God-given rights recognized by the Constitution and by the government are what allow things like libertarianism to exist. Unfortunately, the downside of the First Amendment is that things like leftism and some of the more less good things that are going on in our country, a lot of the immoral things that are going on in our country exist because of the First Amendment. Now, I'm willing to take the good with the bad because, well, like I said, if you want to do you on your property, by all means. That's the beauty of libertarianism. I don't give a shit what you do on your property. But the problem now with the things like leftism and these things that we're able to incubate and grow within the First Amendment is now that they're reaching out and they think that they should tell me what I can and can't say, what I can and can't put in my body, what I can and can't own when it comes to the Second Amendment. It's really an interesting catch-22, and it really, because the libertarian fights with the conservative in me, because the conservative in me wants to squash anything and everything, specifically when it comes to anything that puts our children in danger, which kind of ties into a whole nother political conversation about the LGBTQ, AARP, whatever. I forget. There's so many letters and numbers now. But with the whole gay agenda and the way that they're attacking our children with these quote unquote drag shows for children, that's probably one of the few times that I deviate from my libertarianism is when it comes to the protection of our children.
There's a lot to unpack in all of that. And we are absolutely going to circle back to your views on the LGBT community. What I really want to just get onto before I lose track of it is this concept of God-given rights. Because as I understand it, when America was founded, a lot of people were coming here for religious freedoms.
Correct.
And it feels like the terminology of God-given rights really puts a Christian lens onto what people can and can't do in this country.
Yes and no. So when I say God-given rights, to be fair, America, although not on not on paper. And our founding fathers, there was actually some pretty interesting conversations between the founding fathers in regards to putting actual, into documentation, saying that America is a Christian nation. They wanted religious freedoms. That was a big part of everything. They wanted anybody to come here and practice as they wish, because a lot of them were persecuted back over in Europe. They wanted to write it down as a Christian nation, but they decided against it. But it still was written, that our founding documentation was written by religious men. And of course, they were, the Christian and Catholic faiths, a lot of Protestants, things like that. But if you notice, it doesn't say the Christian God grants me these rights. It doesn't say the Christian God is this. No, it says God-given rights. Now, if you want to say that Allah is your God and he granted you the right to free speech and to bear arms in this beautiful country of mine, then by all means, go ahead, say Allah gave you the rights. If you want to say Buddha gave you the right to free speech, by all means, Buddha gave you that right. That's the beauty of America. Point is, you have unalienable rights granted to you by whatever created you, whatever you decide created you, and that cannot be infringed upon. That cannot be taken from you, because it's not given by man. And so man cannot take it.
So that's a perspective I haven't heard before, genuinely. But it's one I can get behind if I'm understanding it correctly, that it's coming from a position of inclusion. Because whenever I hear God-given rights, I immediately assume that the person who is saying them is speaking specifically about a Christian God, and that there isn't room or thought of any other religions or cultures.
Certainly a lot of people, and to be fair, it is reasonable that a lot of people think that when I say my God-given rights, because when I myself say my God-given rights, I'm referring to the Lord Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior.
Sure, and that comes down to that individual nature of being a libertarian, right? It doesn't matter what you believe or what I believe. It's irrelevant. And I think there's two sides to that coin. One side is that, you can build communities of really like-minded people around you that support and believe the same things you do. The other is a bit uglier, which it's the screw you, I got mine crew, who I'm going to draw a circle around what's mine. And beyond that, I don't care about my neighbors or the people around me, or indeed anybody who thinks differently to how I think.
That's true. But the beauty of the screw you, I got mine, draw a circle in the sand, is that as long as you stay out of that circle, they are no longer your problem. And that's the problem with leftism and or the Democratic side of the aisle, and even on the Republican, not the conservative, but on the Republican side of the aisle, which, in my opinion, the modern GOP party, the Republicans themselves, are just Democrats from 2 to 4 years ago. That's all it is. They're just speed bumps. They're not stopping the Democrats from doing any of this crazy stuff like, drag shows for children, or all the mutilation of genitals on children, puberty blockers and all that crap. They're just roadblocks or not even roadblocks. They're just speed bumps trying to slow it down. They're not fighting against stopping any of this horrible stuff that's destroying our country, and morally destroying our country.
So this is exactly where I wanted to get back to. There's so much there that I really want to sort of slice and dice and get really deep into. But I think where I'd like to probably start is this notion that there are groomers and pedophiles operating openly in the LGBT community, but then also having this contradictory, like, well, church is where we go for strong morals. When almost daily, it seems, in this country, I'm reading articles about police officers, congressmen, and yes, absolutely, members of church groups who are involved in child pornography rings, sex trafficking rings, who are going to prison for multiple offense counts on having sex with underage people. There are millions of people globally living in the LGBT community who have absolutely nothing to do with child sex offenses or genital mutilation, as you put it, or any of these other very horrible things that are being constructed at the moment about and demonizing about the LGBT community.
Oh, certainly. I mean, funny enough, on the interwebs, there's a group of people, and the group, it's called Gays Against Groomers, and they get attacked by the LGBT community and by big media and big social media companies and all that attack them, and they demonetize them, and they're blocking them, and they're deleting their accounts and whatnot. And it's literally gay people against the grooming of children, but they're saying that they're a hate group, or that they're anti-LGBTQ hate group, but they themselves are part of the group. They just don't want the pedophiles in their group, which makes me to believe that if anybody would fight against somebody such as gays against groomers, if you think that they're bad people, I mean, that kind of throws you in the pedophile category. If you're against people who are fighting against the grooming of children, I think that I think there's no place in society for you.
I do think there's a lot more to get into here, but since we're now starting to talk about children and grooming and violence against children, I think it opens up something else I'd really like to get your perspective on, and we are, I guess, limited on time. Violence against children is higher. Gun violence certainly is higher against children in America than it is in any other first world country.
I don't know if that's true, actually. That's something I would have to research. I don't know what the statistics are on that versus other nations. I know it's higher than it should be, because anything higher than 0 is higher than it should be. But I actually don't know if that's.
And look, that is fair. And what I will do at the end of this episode is provide the some facts and figures for where I do my research from. But since Columbine, at time of recording, there have been 633 school shootings in the US in a roughly 20-year period. And as an Australian who comes from a country where there hasn't been a single mass shooting since 1996, that's a really hard statistic for me to reconcile with. It's a figure that I'm not comfortable living with, because to me, that is an endemic problem.
Yes and no. What is the definition of a school shooting? See, the problem with that number, I'm familiar with the 600 number. The problem is that number includes things like shootings that happened near a school, or there's even some that were accidental discharges of, somebody has, somebody's dad has their pistol in their truck, and, something happens and it goes off and shoots a hole through the floorboard. That's written down as a quote unquote school shooting. So that number is pretty disingenuous, but that doesn't change the fact that school shootings are absolutely a terrible, terrible thing. And, I don't know if I'd really, call it an endemic, but it certainly is beyond just a little issue. It's a tremendous issue, and obviously my stance on the protection of children. I think the only solution and I'm probably going to get some flack for this, but hear me out. The only solution to stop school shootings is put guns in schools. Now, whether that means that if your teachers want to volunteer to take safety courses and CCW courses, and and have a required amount of range time per year in order to make sure that they can maintain their proficiency with their sidearms, that if these teachers were armed, I guarantee you that these school shootings would drop drastically, especially in like the inner cities. Now, also with that, we have so many of our veterans who would do anything to protect these kids in these situations, who wouldn't be a bunch of cowards like the officers in Uvalde. Every officer who didn't march in there to take on that shooter not only should be fired, but should be in prison for dereliction of duty. And they stopped the parents who wanted to go in to try and save their own children. They stopped the parents from going in and stopping that shooter. It was bullshit, but I digress. But we have all of these veterans, a lot of these veterans are, wounded, specifically, those who are missing, legs or things like that, who have nothing to do because they're pretty much mostly disabled and they have to sit in a chair all day. So why not put these guys in a chair, put them in the schools where they can, carry their service weapon and patrol the halls, sit at the front door, sit at the office desk. I don't care. Just put somebody who knows how to handle these weapons, who can respond and who would do anything to put themselves between a potential shooter and an innocent child. These soldiers are trained to do that. So why aren't we giving these people a purpose? Which, to go even farther, a lot of the reason that we have the suicide rate with our veterans, specifically our combat veterans, is so high because they lose that purpose after they leave the military, especially the ones who've been, battle damaged. They've been hurt and they're not. We don't want these people like these teachers who are trying to, put all these gay flags up in the schools and teach sexual identity to, to third graders. We don't want that in our schools. We want people who are going to teach our kids to be good, respectable adults. And if we can stop school shootings while doing that, there's no reason not to. I think the solution is as silly as it sounds, and I'm certain plenty of people have rolled their eyes at me already, but more guns. The answer is more guns. Well, more guns and responsible gun owners.
Sure, absolutely. Responsible gun ownership doesn't result in mass shootings, but and you can't overstate that enough. But again, it's not a solution. That's a wish. Yeah, I think when we first sat down to talk, one of the very first things we were talking about was our childhoods, and you and I both agreed that sense of freedom and that ability to go out and explore and be kids was really valuable to both of us growing up. And I feel that filling a school with armed guards and guns is going to deprive children of a lot of that sense of freedom and just growing up being a kid. It's going to take away innocence. Barring a few other issues, big issues that I see with your solution as well, I can't think of anything more traumatic for a child than seeing their teacher getting into an open firefight with an active shooter. And I know that you're already going to say that, well, it's less traumatic than being shot to death by an active shooter.
Correct.
But then my response back to that is that sensible gun control in Australia has resulted in 0 mass shootings in schools, which I believe is the correct number of mass shootings in schools.
But sensible gun control in Australia also led to COVID concentration camps where people were forced into places where they didn't want to be. And, that's the libertarian, America, first kind of guy in me thinking that if anybody wants to come and, herd me onto the train car and push me into the camp, that they can kiss my star-spangled ding-dong because it's not going to happen. And the Second Amendment guarantees my freedom.
So misinformation about Australia is actually something I need to combat pretty regularly, just in conversations with Americans, right down from like how dangerous our animals actually are to people telling me that my government is a fascist government. I've been told it's a communist government. I've been told it's a socialist government. Also, none of these things are true. But let me just set the record straight right now. There is no such thing as an Australian COVID concentration camp.
Oh, I'm being hyperbolic with the concentration camp itself, but there were facilities where they were moving folks to, and I was watching some specifically. It was really interesting with some of the Aboriginal population that way out in the middle of nowhere by themselves, and they were forcing a lot of these folks to come to these areas so that they could be given the shots or do this or that. And these people didn't want to go. They wanted to stay out where they were, and they didn't want to leave. And, more power to them. I wouldn't want to go anywhere that anybody told me to, just on the fact that somebody tried to tell me to do something. But that's just the libertarian / redneck jackass in me. Like I said, it was very hyperbolic for me to say. And I guess it was a little unfair to say concentration camps. That was a bit extreme for me to say. But my point still does stand that people were taken from their homes and from where they lived, and they were put somewhere against their will and held for a amount of time without charge nor trial, all for the sake of a virus that as long as you're young and healthy, it's the death rate was basically 0 for people without pre-existing conditions, at least. But that's another really, really deep rabbit hole we could go down on the whole vaccinations and the whole way that world governments have acted over this whole thing, which was scary. How many of my fellow Americans just kind of bent the knee to all the regulations. And
the one thing I will say about COVID-19 is that I think we are all very, very lucky that it wasn't any deadlier than it was. I don't think globally we handled it well. I don't think we, as communities, handled it well either. There's a lot of different examples of how different governments handled the pandemic, and I'm yet to see one where I'm like, yep, that was 100% the correct thing to do. I don't think it happened. But what I think we're left with in the aftermath of all of this is just this collective just grief of coming to terms with what we all went through, individually or collectively as a community. You know, and I can only really speak from my own experience, but, you know, I emigrated to the US at the height of the pandemic. And if I can give anybody who's listening to this podcast one really good piece of life advice, do not emigrate during a global pandemic. But saying that, you know, everybody's experience of COVID was different. And, you know, for me, there was just a lot of sitting around and just waiting for my status to change. So while all of our experiences of this disease have been very different, some have been personally affected, some have been, you know, a lot of people have lost family members to it. What I think we'll all share is coming to terms with how different governments across the world handled COVID and what that's done to us as a society.
What worries me, and I kind of led on to a little bit there with my fellow Americans, the way they acted, bent the knee. I almost feel as if this was a dry run in the way of the, you know, taking power, because so many of my fellow Americans, people who I thought would, you know, raise that, you know, both middle fingers and just tell them to screw off. You can't tell them what to do. They bent the knee, and even more so, they turned around and they stuck their fingers in my chest and yelled at me from behind a mask that did absolutely nothing and refused to use common sense. I know so many friends of mine who are intelligent people. You know, they're not low IQ, but they refuse to use their own common sense. So we were locked down for 2 years. Well, I say we, but not me. I never wore the mask. Well, unless my wife hit me hard enough, and then occasionally I would if we were in a doctor's office or something. And I, you know, never got the shot, no nothing. And my life didn't change at all. The pandemic was just, if anything, it was nice and quiet for me. The roads were open, traffic was a whole lot less. That was the upsides of the pandemic. The downside is I feel like a lot of my freedoms got stripped away.
So let's just unpack that for a moment, because I really want to get into that. It feels a little bit contradictory to me, and I don't mean to offend you in any way when I say that. All I'm saying is, in your own words, COVID didn't really affect you. The roads were clearer. You could get out. You could do what you wanted to do. You had, you know, almost in a way a better quality of life. But then you're also saying that you felt like your freedoms were being stripped away at the same time. So help me to make sense of that, because, you know, in what way were your freedoms really being restricted?
So my freedoms were impacted in the way that I wasn't able to do things that I really wanted to do, like certain, you know, places were closed down due to, you know, lack of employees. But I was being, to be fair, a little bit hyperbolic when I said my freedoms, but to speak freely, my First Amendment right was absolutely squandered when it comes to speaking on, like, say, the public square that it is. You know, and to be fair, it didn't affect me too much personally, but it did affect a lot of people who I'm friends with or that I follow on, you know, the internet. But so people, you know, when it comes to big tech, on Twitter, on Facebook, on, you know, YouTube, they couldn't speak their minds when it came to COVID.
But that didn't happen to you personally.
I haven't been silenced personally, but that falls on because I have basically no social media presence at all. The last time I think I updated my Facebook was almost 4 years ago when my wife and I got married, or 3 years ago now, something like that. Ooh, don't tell her that. Ooh, I'll get in trouble. Oh.
Well, she won't find out. Wink. As long as she doesn't listen to the podcast, you should be absolutely fine.
I have a comfy couch. I've learned that one.
So what about a member of Congress, a sitting member of Congress, actively calling for national divorce on social media?
I'm actually not opposed to it. And it's a shame because I don't ever want America to break up. But, you know, there's, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I forgot who the other there's another gal. What's her name?
Lauren Boebert?
Yeah, Boebert. Yeah. both of which are very intelligent women, but of course the media portrays them like they're a bunch of big, stupid, hicks, and they're just a bunch of right wingers, and that's a load of horse shit. Sure, they're both a little bit flashy because they're the new up and coming faces of a party that is not the Republican Party. Sure, they might run as Republicans. They are not in the grand old party, and that's a big problem. That's like when MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she was stripped of her appointments, her committees. That was entirely political. That was AOC and some of the girls they call the squad over on the left. That was them trying to silence her because she was rocking the boat for them. And I don't like the tit for tat. But back to the whole national divorce thing, it could never happen, at least not peacefully. But I do think that it's time that something does need to happen. If that means the whole idea of the greater Idaho, where Idaho, basically a large chunk of, I think it's some of Nevada, but mostly of eastern Oregon will be absorbed into Nevada, or not into Nevada, into Idaho. And hopefully eventually it'll actually take the northern part of California, the area that we consider to be the quote unquote state of Jefferson. And it's a bunch of people who are like-minded, who we politically align ourselves with the values of folks from rural states like Idaho, because Northern California it's country. It's as country gets. I mean, there's orchards, there's row crops, there's cattle like you wouldn't believe. It's very, very rural. And if you ever look at the county map for elections, the entire state of California is a deep red. If you take out San Francisco, you take out LA, and then I forget where the third spot is, but you take out there's like three or four counties, you take it out and the state's entirely red.
But that argument involves taking out about 80% of the population of the state.
Certainly. But see, that's the problem, is that there's so many people and there's so much territory that's being governed by people who live completely different lives.
Sure, I get that. And I get that it can be really frustrating if you're from one part of a state or one part of the country that leans politically a different way. I mean, you could make the reverse statement about Texas, right? If you took out all of the land and just left the cities, Texas is probably blue, or at the very least a deep shade of purple. I don't know, we could really get into this and talk back and forth about it all day, but I am conscious that we are rapidly approaching the end of our time together. So, what I would like to ask you, though, and it's a question I like to ask everybody who comes onto this podcast, and I think you're uniquely positioned to answer this in that you're the first person from a rural area I've spoken to. What is something about the United States, whether you're a long-time citizen, whether you were born here, whether you are just visiting, what is something about the US that you think everybody needs to experience?
There is one thing in particular that exists only here, and again, as a rather large human being, there are almost no times in my life where I feel small, whether that be emotionally or physically. I never feel small. I don't really ever feel vulnerable. But the Redwood Coast, to go walk with the giants out there, these massive redwoods and these sequoias that are hundreds of feet tall. I mean, there's photos, you can see postcards of the trees, and sure, they look big, but you don't understand the majesty and the humbling, just the whole atmosphere being within a grove of redwoods, of old growth redwoods, or of these giant sequoias. It is just, you feel so small. It really gives you perspective on where you stand in this giant universe, on this wet rock spinning through space. You will never feel more humbled by the majesty of nature.
I know you said you've never felt vulnerable before, but to me that sense of being humbled, it's almost like what we were talking about before, what feels like a long time ago now, that sense of being humbled and learning and feeling not insignificant is not necessarily the right word, but feeling your very small place, as you put it, in this very large world. And wouldn't it be really cool if that feeling could stay with you just a little bit longer than being in that park? When you return to your 9 to 5 or whatever your daily grind is, if you could retain that humility.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a really quite poetic and beautiful place to leave it today, because, and I do want to say thank you, because I don't often get a chance to talk to people who see the world through a very different lens to me. And I'm a strong believer that it's only through having conversations like these that we find any kind of middle ground or understanding. I've said in my podcast before, it really feels like this country is at war with itself. And that's why I've sat down to have these conversations, is to try and just find whatever middle ground is still available to us and celebrate it.
Yeah. If I might add, I do my best to listen to the other side. With my job, it allows me to listen to podcasts and YouTube videos and documented, all that kind of stuff. I consume a tremendous amount of news. And I find myself, I almost enjoy listening to the other side more than, well, actually, I take that back. I absolutely enjoy listening to the other side far more than I like listening to those who are more politically aligned with myself. And if I could give one piece of advice to the listeners, is listen to somebody that you either you don't like, or even maybe somebody who you outright hate, but ask yourself why you might hate this person and their opinions. And I'm talking about, for, talking heads, for whether it be newscasters or YouTube personalities, things like that. But find somebody who you have been told to hate, or you just feel like you're supposed to not like because they're on the other side, and genuinely give them a chance to listen to them, to try to understand their side. I used to be far more conservative than I am today because I listened to folks who don't necessarily agree with me. And I broke out of my echo chamber, and it takes a long time, especially for an opinionated guy like myself. My heart is so much happier ever since I started listening to those on the other side, because I have so much more understanding for people. And I understand people who I never really understood before. It's actually something interesting enough. My brother, he's gay, and our relationship was growing up super, super stressed. I mean, we never got along, never, ever, ever. And it wasn't because he was gay. He was a dick. But now that I've listened to a lot more people from his side of the aisle, we can understand each other, and we can have these conversations. And it's interesting that listening to, people who are politically opposed to me, my relationship with my brother is now better. And it's just really, opening yourself. Even if you don't get anything from it right away, eventually you might. And it's well worth the endeavor.
Thank you very much for sharing that, because it's such a good live example of why I started this podcast in the first place. What we're seeking to do is to sit down with people from all across America, from very different walks of life. And that means different political beliefs. It means different occupations. It means different races, religions, social economic backgrounds and upbringings. It means different beliefs, all of these things. And then it means trying to find a common thread, a common ground, a common place of understanding. And the only thing I want for people to take away from every single one of these conversations is something that you can relate to the person that you're listening to. And you won't be all of it. It absolutely won't. But like I said, it's such a good example. What you've just told me about your brother is a perfect way of sort of summarizing why we're here. And it sounds like you and your family are well on your way to finding that common ground after quite a long time of not having it.
Well, I think this is a wonderful step in the right direction for us as a nation. We need more of this.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for sharing your story and your views today, and for helping me to unpack a little bit more about America.
My pleasure.
So I said within that conversation quite a few times there's a lot to unpack there. And I think that's just so true of broadly American society, which is something I'm having a deeper appreciation for. The more of these conversations I have, the more people I get to meet, and the more I get to ask them about, what is it you really believe and what is really valuable to you? And with Ryan, there's so many things that I do identify with. I do believe dirty hands, clean money, because the opposite is certainly not always true. But there are certainly things he says that I vehemently disagree with, particularly his views on the LGBT community. And I do want to say, thank you to Ryan for admitting when he was being hyperbolic. And I will also say in return, as I promised I would, I went away and I did more research about violence against children in the US and what those sorts of statistics look like. And what I found, the deeper I went and the more news sources I looked at and the more scientific sources I looked at, was the information is varied at best. There's a lot of noise out there, particularly when it comes to what is happening with guns in this country, and especially what happened, like how statistics are measured. So the question becomes, who do you trust? Do you trust Fox News? Do you trust CNN? Do you trust MSN? Do you where do you get your information from, and what do you believe? Do you get it from the dark web? Do you get it from Reddit? Do you get it from Twitter? And God, I hope not, or at least not in singularity, from any one of those sources. Because as Ryan mentioned, critical thinking is really important. But critical thinking to me means discerning a lot of different information. Not just a willingness to distrust information as it's presented to you, but an active pursuit of looking for more information. So what I did following this conversation is do a little bit more research. When I say a little bit, I went out for hours and I wanted to find reliable sources. What I found was a website called kff.org, which is a non-partisan, science-driven data collection website for a lot of different things happening in the US, but one of them is gun violence. And what I found particularly relevant on that site is how the US stacks up to its peer countries. Now, you may be someone who thinks that the US doesn't have any peers, and that's fine. I'd encourage you to expand your worldview. But that compares the US to countries like Japan, the UK, Germany, and yes, Australia. We made the list. So I'm not going to sit here and preach facts and figures and quotes at you. I am just going to say that I encourage people to think critically, and I encourage people to come back to looking at other perspectives. And one of the things I really appreciated about Ryan today was where this conversation ended and talking about the growth that he's himself has experienced by listening to people from the other side. And you may listen to that conversation today and you may think he hasn't learned a thing because his views are not in line with mine. But I would challenge that. And I would say that he's actively out there searching for answers to questions that he has. And at the end of the day, I'm 100% on board with anybody who is investing their time doing that. On the subject of Australian concentration camps, and you definitely heard my voice go up an octave when that was mentioned, I will say, did we handle COVID perfectly? No one did. Have we ever had concentration camps in Australia? We absolutely have, and it has been in and around how we have treated refugees and immigrants to our country. And that is a perfect, almost like it was planned, segue into next episode, where I am sitting down with someone who has lived as an undocumented immigrant in this country for more than 3 decades of his life. It is an amazing story. I found it very emotional story, and I cannot wait to share it with you. So please tune in next week when we unpack a little bit more about America. I've been John Easterling. Thank you very, very much for listening.